Every man who marched toward the Holy Land believed the legends of the great Christian kings. They expected a sovereign to sit safely upon a golden throne, wearing an immaculate crown, and letting his generals do the bleeding. They expected a distant symbol of authority who directed empires from behind high stone walls. But Richard the Lionheart was not a symbol. He was the weapon. When the Third Crusade hung on the brink of total annihilation, it was not royal decrees or political compromise that saved the Christian world. It was a king who plunged his own boots into the surf, wielding a battle axe on the front line alongside common foot soldiers, and proving that Christian chivalry was a force of absolute physical dominance. You have been told that the Crusades were defined by slow, defensive attrition, yet the actual records reveal a story of shocking military genius and unyielding courage that shattered the greatest armies of the East. This is the chronicle of the sovereign who refused to hide. By the summer of 1192, the Third Crusade was dying in the sand. Saladin, the legendary Sultan of Islam, had unleashed tens of thousands of Turkish warriors to wipe the remaining Christian presence from the coast of Palestine. His primary target was Jaffa, the vital port city that secured the lifeline to the sea. Saladin threw his entire army against the walls, breaching the gates, slaughtering the garrison, and forcing the surviving Christian defenders to retreat into the citadel for a final, desperate stand. The city was considered lost. Saladin believed the crusade was effectively finished. He was entirely wrong. 3 days north, in the city of Acre, Richard received word of the disaster. Most commanders would have spent weeks gathering a massive force, but Richard knew that every hour spent planning was an hour his people spent dying. He gathered just 50 knights and several hundred Italian crossbowmen, boarded a small fleet of galleys, and tore down the coast through a raging Mediterranean storm. When his ships dropped anchor in the harbor of Jaffa, the beach was an inferno of iron and blood. Thousands of Turkish troops lined the shore, their banners fluttering in the sea breeze, waiting to slaughter anyone who dared to land. From the ramparts of the citadel, a lone Christian soldier saw the royal standard of England floating over the water. He broke from the defense, threw himself from the walls into the sea, and swam desperately toward the king's galley. He hauled himself over the gunwale, gasping for air, and delivered the grim reality to his king. The garrison was entirely surrounded, the outer city had fallen, and the swords of the enemy were at the throats of the remaining survivors. The advisors around Richard immediately begged him to turn back. They argued that attacking such overwhelming numbers with a handful of men was absolute suicide. Richard looked at the burning city, then turned to his nobles. He stated that if he abandoned his men to die, he would never deserve to wear a crown again. He did not wait for his army to form a line. He did not issue a complex tactical order. Richard leaped over the side of his galley, plunging waist-deep into the breaking waves. He held a heavy iron crossbow in one hand and a massive Danish battle axe in the other. When his knights saw their king wading into the surf ahead of them, the fear evaporated from their veins. They threw themselves into the water behind him, forming a wall of interlocking shields right in the breaking waves. The Turkish forces on the beach had never witnessed a monarch fight like a common mercenary. The sheer terror of Richard's physical presence froze the front line. He hacked his way through the vanguard, his axe clearing a path of broken armor and shattered shields. The Italian crossbowmen set up their heavy pavises in the wet sand, unleashing a relentless, synchronized volley of iron bolts that tore through the lightly armored Turkish cavalry. Richard did not just hold the beach, he drove the entire vanguard backward into the streets of Jaffa. He recaptured the city gates, rallied the starving survivors from the citadel, and forced Saladin's massive army to retreat into the hills. The next morning, Saladin attempted a desperate counterattack at dawn, hoping to catch the small Christian force off guard while they slept on the beach. Richard had no time to put on his full-plate armor. He ran out onto the sand in nothing but his mail shirt, holding a spear. He had only 10 mounted horses left in his entire force. He placed his crossbowmen in pairs, one man loading while the other fired, creating a medieval machine gun that broke every single cavalry charge Saladin unleashed. At the height of the battle, Saladin saw Richard fighting on foot in the middle of the melee, his sword broken and his uniform drenched in blood. In an act of profound martial respect, Saladin ordered his own brother to ride through the lines and present the English king with 2 magnificent Arabian stallions, stating that such a warrior should never be forced to fight on foot. Richard accepted the horses, mounted up, and rode straight back into the slaughter. By sunset, Saladin's army was broken and retreating toward Jerusalem. That is how Richard secured the survival of the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. But his legendary tactical dominance was not a sudden miracle. It was the result of a lifetime of brutal, relentless warfare that began long before he ever set foot in the Holy Desert. To see the origin of this warrior archetype, one must look away from the sun-drenched sands of Palestine and into the dark, rocky highlands of southwestern France. Long before he was the King of England, Richard was the Duke of Aquitaine, a vast territory filled with rebellious, fiercely independent lords who recognized no law but the sword. The rebel barons believed that a teenage prince could easily be bullied and broken. They were entirely wrong. Richard spent his youth campaigning through the rugged terrain of Gascony and Poitou, learning the realities of siege warfare and personal combat in the mud and rain. He did not manage these campaigns from a distant pavilion. He was always the first man up the scaling ladders, the man who personally checked the tension on the trebuchets, and the commander who slept on the bare earth with his vanguard. The defining moment of his youth came at the fortress of Taillebourg. Taillebourg was considered completely impregnable. It sat atop a sheer, towering cliff of solid stone, surrounded by 3 massive rings of defensive walls, and stocked with enough provisions to survive a decade-long siege. The rebel lords mocked Richard from the battlements, confident that the young duke would break his army against the rocks. Richard did not launch a standard, predictable assault. He spent the first 3 days systematically destroying the surrounding countryside, burning the crops and cutting off every road into the valley to show the defenders that no help was coming. Then he deliberately faked a tactical retreat, pulling his siege engines back into the tree line. The defenders took the bait. Believing the young prince had lost his nerve, the garrison threw open the heavy iron gates and poured out of the fortress to hunt down the retreating vanguard. He had anticipated their charge, ambushed the garrison in the open valley, and forced his way through the open gates before the portcullis could be lowered. Within a single afternoon, the fortress that had defied empires for a century was entirely reduced to ash. The rebel lords who had mocked him were forced to kneel in the dirt, stripping off their swords and begging for mercy from a boy who had broken them through sheer tactical audacity. This brutal proving ground created the discipline that would later define the Third Crusade. When Richard finally inherited the crown of England in 1189, he did not treat the kingdom as a luxury. He treated it as a forge. He liquidated the royal treasury, sold off castles, and taxed the realm to its absolute limit for one singular purpose: to build the most advanced, heavily armored, and highly disciplined military machine the Western world had ever seen. When this massive Western force arrived in the Holy Land, they found the Christian vanguard trapped in a living nightmare at the city of Acre. The Christian army had been besieging the strategic Muslim stronghold for 2 agonizing years, but they were simultaneously surrounded from behind by Saladin's main field army. Disease, starvation, and a burning desert fever were killing more men than the sword. The Crusade was completely deadlocked, and morale had collapsed entirely. Then the royal fleet of England sailed into the bay. Richard stepped off his flagship, but he was not victorious yet. Within days of his arrival, he was struck down by arnaldia, a deadly, burning, scurvy-like fever that caused his teeth to loosen and his skin to peel off in agonizing patches. Most men would have been completely incapacitated by the pain. Richard refused to close his eyes. He was too weak to stand, his body shaking from the violent chills of the fever, yet he refused to leave the battlefield. He had his men construct a heavy wooden pavis, a giant shield lined with iron plates, right at the edge of the defensive trenches. Lying on his side on that mattress, Richard picked up a massive iron crossbow. With his hands trembling from the sickness, he steadily aimed through a narrow slit in the wood, personally shooting the defenders off the walls of Acre and directing the heavy trebuchets where to strike the stone towers. The sight of their king defying death itself injected an electric fury into the entire Christian army. French, English, and German knights fought with renewed intensity, inspired by a leader who refused to let human weakness compromise his duty. Within just 5 weeks of Richard's arrival on that mattress, the massive fortress of Acre surrendered, delivering a decisive blow that saved the Third Crusade from total ruin. He had broken the stalemate and restored the pride of the Western Knights. But Saladin was already gathering his full strength further south, waiting to crush the Crusaders in the open field. In late August 1191, Richard began his legendary march south toward the vital port of Jaffa. This march was a masterclass in military logistics and ironclad discipline that completely baffled the Muslim chroniclers of the era. Saladin unleashed his elite horse archers to shadow the Christian column, hovering around the edges like a pack of wolves, launching thousands of arrows into the ranks every single day. Richard knew that if his knights broke formation to chase the archers, they would be isolated and slaughtered in the deep sand. He organized his army into a giant, moving fortress. The infantry marched on the landward side, their heavy chainmail and iron shields absorbing the endless rain of arrows, while the elite heavy cavalry marched safely between the foot soldiers and the sea. Muslim historians wrote with absolute awe that they saw Christian infantrymen marching forward with up to 10 arrows sticking out of their heavy mail shirt, yet they never broke step. Richard rode up and down the line, enforcing absolute, agonizing silence and order. He was waiting for the perfect tactical moment. He was waiting for the Battle of Arsuf. On the morning of September 7th, 1191, Saladin decided to throw his entire imperial army of over 30,000 warriors against the Crusader column near the forest of Arsuf. The sky went black with the smoke of kettle drums and the roar of horns. Trumpets blared as thousands of Sudanese foot soldiers, Bedouin skirmishers, and elite Turkish Mamluks slammed into the rear guard of the Christian line. The pressure was immense. The Knights Hospitaller, who held the absolute rear of the formation, were being forced to march backward, fighting off hordes of fanatical infantry while their horses were being slaughtered beneath them. The Grand Master of the Hospitallers rode forward to Richard, begging for permission to launch a heavy cavalry charge to relieve the pressure. Richard refused. He told him to hold the line and keep marching. He knew that if the charge was launched too early, Saladin's cavalry would simply wheel away, encircle the knights, and destroy them in detail. He needed the Turkish army to fully commit their entire force into the melee before he unleashed the hammer. The arrows were falling so thick that it looked like snow upon the dark ground. The Hospitallers could endure the slaughter no longer. 2 knights, the Marshal of the Hospital and Baldwin de Caron, broke from the ranks, raised their swords, and screamed the battle cry of the Crusade, Sanctum Sepulchrum. The entire rear guard followed them, bursting through the infantry line like a tidal wave of steel. Richard's perfect plan had been shattered by human impatience. Most commanders would have panicked, but Richard possessed the rare ability to turn a battlefield disaster into an instant victory. Seeing that the charge had begun, he instantly ordered the entire army to support the advance. He rode to the very front of the charge, leading the elite heavy cavalry straight into the heart of Saladin's elite bodyguard. The impact was cataclysmic. The heavy Western destriers, carrying knights in solid iron mail, crushed everything in their path. Richard was a whirlwind of steel in the center of the slaughter. The contemporary records state that he mowed down the enemy like a reaper cutting grain, his sword arm moving with a terrifying mechanical precision that left a circle of dead warriors around him wherever he rode. Saladin's army, which had never been decisively defeated in the open field since the rise of their sultan, was completely overwhelmed by the speed and weight of the Christian response. They broke and fled into the hills, leaving thousands of their elite troops dead on the field of Arsuf. It was the ultimate triumph of the Third Crusade. Richard had outthought, outdisciplined, and outfought the greatest general of the East, shattering the myth of Muslim invincibility and restoring the honor of the cross. Richard the Lionheart never captured Jerusalem, but he did something far more permanent. He proved that the ideal of the Christian warrior was not a myth written in romantic poems. He lived that ideal in the mud of France, the fever trenches of Acre, and the red sands of Jaffa. He was a monarch who earned his majesty through the strength of his own arm and the unyielding loyalty he showed to the men who bled for him. When the kings of the world chose to hide in their palaces, the Lionheart stood upon the shore, hold the line for everything he believed in. This is the true standard of leadership that history can never erase. If you want to see the unyielding strength of the Western spirit brought to life through pristine historical storytelling, make sure you stay locked into this channel. Join the Brotherhood of Ash and Iron on YouTube and Facebook right now, and never miss a single Chronicle of Greatness.